Hi, I'm Eric. I'm back with another video. It is August 6th, Wednesday, 2025. I think some of you may not be aware, so I'll bring it to your attention that today is I believe it's the 80th anniversary of the use of nuclear weapons, August 6th, 1945. So here we are 80 years later to the day after an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. And, 100,000 people were killed immediately. Hiroshima was devastated. 3 years later, or 3 days later rather, Nagasaki was hit by another atomic weapon. One of them, I think the Hiroshima bomb was used uranium-235, which is uranium is an element, and usually it appears with the 235 or 238 is determined it means the number of particles that make up the atom, protons and neutrons. But anyway, so uranium-235 was used because that's the kind of uranium that we can say it's fissile, meaning that if you create enough force on an atom, it will break apart, and when it breaks apart, there's an enormous amount of energy that comes out of it. In the process of nuclear research, a new element appeared called plutonium, and it's aptly named because Pluto was the god of death in the Roman pantheon of gods. Anyway, so here we are 80 years later, and I want to talk about the idea of brinkmanship. I haven't seen that word used. There's a lot of commentators now who are talking about this, especially people with military backgrounds. So that's positive that they're actually raising the issue of potential nuclear war. So that's what I want to talk about. Recently, I saw a clip of, President Trump is engaging in some extremely, provocative actions. So, he's been threatening Russia with sanctions if Russia doesn't immediately stop its campaign to take out the U.S.-sponsored coup regime in Ukraine. So here you have, starting actually, at the end of World War II, these Ukrainian nationalists who had allied themselves with the Nazis during World War II killed 100,000 Poles, Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, anybody who didn't agree with them, with their ideas of Ukrainian racial superiority, which is basically, that's the basis of Ukrainian nationalism. The CIA saw them as a useful tool against the Soviet Union. So as a result, after World War II, there was actually a guerrilla war going on inside of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. So eventually the Red Army, the Soviets were able to, capture these guys, either kill them or put them in prison. This is by the middle of the 1950s. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at that time, exercised his sense of compassion by giving these people amnesty. So they got released from prison. They went underground, and sure enough, in 1990, after the Soviet Union ends, they reappear and say, "Hi, we Nazis are back, but we don't want to talk about it too loudly, but give us some time." So that's 1990, and then by 2004, actually by 2004, they had enough power to overthrow an election where the winning candidate Yanukovych actually won the election, but there was such an uproar that there was a recount, quote unquote, and a guy named, I think his name was Yushchenko, I think that's his name is. And his wife was actually an American, probably a CIA agent. So he's a U.S. puppet, secretly U.S. puppet. And and the first thing he did was to recognize Stefan Bandera, who was the leader of these Ukrainian Nazis, a national hero. So there's this guy involved in war crimes. He's now the national hero. This is what Ukrainian politics in the 21st century is like. Okay, so then we get to 2014. There's a coup, and Yanukovych had actually won the election again in 2010, and then 2014, the U.S. sponsored a coup. This is Biden's coup. That's not quite fair. Obama was the president at the time, and Biden was his lieutenant, and Victoria Nuland was under him. And between the three of them, they said, okay, let's get rid of this democracy and create real democracy, which is a puppet, installed by the United States. This is a real democracy in Ukraine. And out of that, eventually we had Russia finally, putting its foot down and saying, you guys, you want to put nuclear missiles in Ukraine, you want to wipe out the Russian-speaking population, you're wiping out the Russian Orthodox Church, you don't even hold elections, and you're calling yourself a democracy. Enough is enough. We've had it with you guys. And so they've been winning. And so Trump is saying to Putin, as if Putin is the only one who has any opinions on this. He says, we got to stop the killing in Ukraine. Of course, Gaza, it's okay to starve these people to death, but they're not really human anyway, so they don't really count. We got to get that golf course in Gaza. We got to get to the beach resort in Gaza. So we won't worry about those people, but our people who are fighting against Russia, yes, we have to show great compassion towards them. So, and if Russia doesn't accede to my demands as the emperor of the universe, we're going to put sanctions on them, none of which have worked. And even Trump himself says sanctions probably won't work. Those Russians are wily. You gotta, the mentality of these people is just unbelievable. So that's one data point. And then you have this these mutual, spats on X going back and forth between Lindsey Graham and Trump and Dmitry Medvedev. And Dmitry Medvedev was the former president of the Russian Federation, and now he's the head of I think it's the deputy chairman of the National Security Council. He's got a high position in the Russian government, and he says what people really want to. If you ask it. I shouldn't say this because I'm not a Russian, but and some people are skeptical of Dmitry Medvedev because in the past he represented the kind of liberal wing of the Russian hierarchy. But I have a theory. I can't prove this. I have a theory that Obama, had talks with Dmitry Medvedev and they were going to negotiate things. And don't worry, Obama's saying, don't worry. When I get reelected, we'll have some real negotiations. And nothing of the kind happened. Libya, Russia acquiesced to a quote-unquote peacekeeping mission in Libya, but which was really a regime change operation to wipe out the government of Muammar Gaddafi, who wanted to create a gold-based currency for all of Africa. So he had to go, and they manufactured. This is Obama and Biden and Hillary Clinton. All those people. They make up a story about how bad Muammar Gaddafi is, even though they have the highest standard of living in Africa based on their oil revenues. They go in there, they destroy the country, they kill Muammar Gaddafi. Hillary Clinton even laughs about it. This is the mentality of these people. Compassion is not in their mental makeup. in any case, so Dmitry Medvedev, I think, had a kind of a what can I say, a come to Stalin moment. They may not like me for saying that, but Stalin had no illusions about the venality of these people, and I think Dmitry Medvedev probably has a similar attitude. So when Trump was making accusations about the dead economies of India and I think it was Russia, Medvedev dropped the hint that Russia has something called the dead hand. And the dead hand is basically a fail-safe, mutually assured destruction system. So basically what happens, for those of you who aren't aware of it, what happens is that the United States has been wanting to stage a first strike, that is a decapitating, incapacitating nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and Russia for many, many decades. I mean, we're talking about going back to 1945. They were talking about this. Even Harry Truman, was threatening Stalin back then. So, in response to these continuing, efforts by the United States to create a first strike capability, what Russia did was they created a system whereby, in case the leadership of Russia, and I'm talking about both the military leadership as well as the civilian leadership, if they're not broadcasting any signals, there's a like a system built into the Russian defense apparatus, whereby if they don't hear a message from the president or anybody in the government saying everything's okay, or from military leaders, if they don't hear anything, then automatically missiles will be fired, which have the codes to unlock a massive nuclear counter-strike on the United States. It's called the dead hand, which means that if we're dead, we're going to kill you too. So don't even think about it. So what does Trump do in response to this threat? So the United States has been threatening Russia. Its nuclear policy, U.S. nuclear policy, is to say that we reserve the right to create a first strike on any country that we feel like it. And so Russia finally said, we're going to have to do something about this. And so that was the reason why Dmitry Medvedev, I think, just gave a gentle hint to Trump that, watch your step. So what Trump does is he interprets the dead hand as being a Russian first strike capability, that is not what it is. So what does Trump do? He sends submarines apparently closer to the Russian borders. Now there's different opinions on this. Some people say that there are submarines already operational, which can fire nuclear missiles into Russia, and they can, anytime the U.S. government decides they want to do that, they can. But Scott Ritter has pointed out that if they position these submarines closer to the Russian coastline, then it's going to give the Russians not only less time, but less ability to use their radar to warn the system that they're under attack. So it increases the possibility of this nuclear first strike. So what Trump has done is by he's created a self-fulfilling prophecy where the U.S. threatens Russia. Russia says, well, if you do that, we'll do this. And then the United States says, well, because you're threatening us, we're going to do that. So this is a kind of a classic example of how the aggressor country blames the target of their aggression for being violent and being aggressive when they're the one who's causing the problem in the first place. So that brings us to the topic of brinkmanship, because during the 1950s, you had this was during the Eisenhower administration, and the Secretary of State at that time was named John Foster Dulles. His brother was Allen Dulles, and Allen Dulles was the creator of the CIA. However, what most Americans, and certainly I never knew until I read the book, The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush, the father, was that Allen Dulles had actually collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. And John Foster Dulles, during the 1930s, was a lawyer he was doing legal work for the Nazis. So you have these Nazi collaborators right in the middle of the United States government, and they're talking about taking out the Soviet Union. And the strategy is called Brinksmanship, where it's like basically what Brinksmanship is nuclear chicken. So if you have two stupid high school guys and they both have a car and they say, okay, we're going to drive our cars at full speed right up to each other, and whoever veers away is called the chicken. And this is the equivalent of Brinksmanship, where you have escalation of a crisis, expecting that the other party will back off. And so this has been the strategy of the United States for literally decades against the Soviet Union and now against Russia. So Brinksmanship basically led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And in that situation, the United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey. So they're like, 15 minutes, 20, whatever it is, minutes away from Moscow. Moscow, says to itself, what the hell are they doing with these missiles? Maybe we should give them a taste of their own medicine. And then, so the Soviet Union puts missiles into Cuba. And Kennedy flies there's a spy plane flying over Cuba. They see these missiles. Oh, those Russians, they're threatening us. Well, maybe you shouldn't have put your missiles into Turkey in the first place, right? But we won't talk about that. And of course, eventually, John Kennedy had the wherewithal, the moral courage to flout his generals who actually wanted a nuclear war, and talk with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. And he said, let's both be chicken. Let's both cut out this crap about threatening each other with nuclear weapons. It was under Kennedy that they had the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and also the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty proceeded after that. And then in 1972, there was I think it was the ABM Treaty. So there was a period of time when the U.S. leadership, despite its Soviet hostility towards the Soviet Union, which was really masking their hostility towards Russia, they had enough sense to back off and put some mechanisms in place that they could prevent a nuclear war. Then we flash forward to Ronald Reagan, and he decides to turn up the heat again. So he starts calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. The reason why Russia is invited into African countries now is because they're saying, we remember when you guys were helping us decolonize ourselves from these Western colonial creeps, and yet the United States calls Russia the aggressor, even though they were actually helping the African people. So again, this is an example of where you turn the tables, where you accuse the other you accuse the Soviet Union, or you accuse Russia of what you're actually doing. So here we are, and in 1980, and Ronald Reagan is accusing the Soviet Union of being the evil empire, and they put missiles into Germany, into Eastern Europe, aimed at Russia. And these missiles, again, it's the same kind of recreating this Cuban Missile Crisis, where you have missiles very close to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union says, okay, fine, we're going to put missiles in, and we're going to counterattack. And but the people in Europe, rebelled against this crazy scheme. And in the United States, people also, were very upset about it. I was part of the anti-nuclear movement during the 1980s. As I mentioned in an earlier video, a colleague of mine, we were Zen monks at the time, we went to the Soviet consulate and said, hey, we got to talk. So, of course, eventually public pressure resulted in Reagan finally realizing that threatening the Soviet Union really wasn't a good idea. And so they created the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which took all those missiles out of Europe and brought the temperature down. But then the Soviet Union and Gorbachev made a strategic mistake. They said, we're tired of this Cold War, so let's just cool it, and we're pulling our troops out of Eastern Europe, which had been there to protect the Soviet Union from another invasion. You have to remember, in World War II, the Soviet Union was invaded by Germany and its allies through Eastern Europe into the Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Europe for that reason. And Gorbachev said, let's call this Cold War off. We're withdrawing our troops. We're ending what we call the Warsaw Pact, which incidentally was created in response to NATO. NATO was created after World War II, presumably to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union. And it was populated by Nazi officers. So NATO, you could call it Nazio, because the intent has always been the same, to destroy Russia. It's always been the same. So that was the end of the Cold War. Russia foolishly disarmed, and NATO, of course, broke its promises not to expand. They expand, and the sequence of events leading up to today is here, where the INF Treaty has been trashed. That was Donald Trump. Donald Trump insists that this war in Ukraine is not his, even though he's threatening Russia. He came in as the peace candidate, the peace president, and now he's threatening Russia with sanctions and threatening Russia by sending nuclear submarines right up to Russia's shores. So we are replaying brinkmanship. The only difference being that the stakes are much higher because the quality of the missiles, the speed at which they travel, is much greater. So that's the situation we're facing. So that's what I want to talk about here. Now I got a couple of other topics I want to discuss. One of the things that they say is that if Ukraine loses this war, it's going to be a disaster for them. And the reality is that I was just listening to a podcast earlier today where they said that before this special military operation started in 2022, the population of Ukraine was about 35 million. But what is also true is that at the end of World War II, the population of Ukraine was about 35 million. They'd lost several million people because of the invasion of the Nazi forces. But between 1948 or so, I did a check on this. Around 1948, they did a census. There were about 35 million people. By 1994, this is just right after the peak of the Soviet Union ending, Ukraine had a population of 53 million. And now they're saying that their population is back down, or it was back down to 35 million, and yet there's millions of Ukrainians leaving. The death rate is 10 times their birth rate. This is a country that is on the verge of vanishing demographically. So when people say, oh, we've got to protect Ukraine from the Russians, it's this exact opposite. Ukraine thrived during the Soviet period, and I have a very good friend who lives in Ukraine, and she's told me as much. And other people I've met, I had friends in Crimea, in the city of Sevastopol, and both people that I know, one particular, said that during the Soviet times he had a great life. He really liked the Soviet Union. So, and Crimea, of course, was part of Ukraine during the Soviet period after Khrushchev changed the title of it, so to speak, from being part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But it still continued as part of the Soviet Union, and it was prospering, doing quite well. But when the Soviet Union ended, these nationalistic elements, who were, you can call them nationalists, but what they really are is corrupt political opportunists, and they basically stole millions of dollars or billions of dollars of assets of the people of Ukraine, and that's who are the real power in Ukraine was exercised by these gangster oligarchs. So for them to say that the Ukraine would be better off without Russia taking it back is it's questionable at best. Of course, what Russia does in the final analysis is unclear. But what we can say is that those areas such as Mariupol, which was under the control of the Ukrainian government, even though the population there was ethnic Russian, they chafed under the Ukraine government. It was treating them very, very poorly. Eventually, there's a battle for the city. Mariupol is virtually destroyed, and as soon as the Russians take control, they rebuild the city. So when people say, "Oh, if Russia wins this war in Ukraine, it'll be a disaster for Ukraine," as if Ukraine isn't already a disaster. So this is another example of where truth is turned on its head. This happens all the time. One of the things I want to talk about also is the fact that Russia essentially during the Soviet period was pretty much self-sufficient. Russia is such a large country that it has all the resources that an entity needs in order to take care of itself. It has the oil, it has the minerals, it has the agricultural land, so it could basically survive on its own without the need for outside stuff. But the problem was that Western propaganda, you could say, seduced the people of the Soviet Union, so that they thought that they really wanted to be part of the cool kids club, and they wanted to be able to smoke Marlboro cigarettes, not the Soviet cigarettes, or they wanted to wear Levi jeans instead of Russian-made clothing, and it was that kind of mentality that allowed the Soviet Union to let its guard down to the extent that the Western countries could gain control of the situation, and that was how the Soviet Union fell. And then, of course, once they had control, they obliterated the Soviet economy, and the Soviet Union was on the verge of complete collapse and dissolution. But fortunately, you could say, fortunately for Russia, not so fortunate for the United States and Europe, some obscure bureaucrat who was he was a KGB officer, but he was just this. At the time he was just like a bureaucrat in the city of St. Petersburg. For some reason, Boris Yeltsin, who had been completely seduced by the West and had really allowed his country to be raped, he decided, okay, well, let's see. I think this guy, this guy Vladimir Putin, I think he'll be okay. He'll work. And Vladimir Putin himself had kind of soured on the Soviet idea and became more or less anti-communist, and he wanted to increase the stature of the Russian Orthodox Church, and also allow he basically gave the new oligarch class that had taken over Russia from the Soviet Union. He gave them, a degree of latitude. So, or I could say that after the Soviet Union fell by the year 2000, the oligarchs had virtually complete control. They were really making a terrible situation for the Russian people. And when Vladimir Putin came into office, he said, look, I'm the president of the Russian Federation. You can do what you want. I'm not going to attack you, but stay out of politics. And so gradually, the oligarchs, even though they still do have a lot of power, don't have the kind of control that they used to have. So, but the main point here is that Russia gave up a lot of its sovereignty by relying on Western products. And so when these sanctions came into effect, they thought they were going to be able to take Russia down, but they didn't realize that Russia is actually has the capacity to be self-sufficient. And it's not just self-sufficient in terms of resources. Its educational system, also during the Soviet Union, was probably the best educational system in the world. So, because there's such a strong emphasis on mathematics and science in Russia, they're able to create the kinds of weapons that are putting the NATO weapons to shame. So Russia doesn't. The big mistake that Russia made was in thinking that they could be part of the West, that they could be in the cool kids club of the U.S. and the British and the French and the Germans and all those people. And when they really didn't understand the I could say innate hostility towards Russia, the envy of Russia, its resources, its unwillingness to be part of the Western ideology of Western Christianity versus the Russian Orthodox, which is more traditional Christianity. So Russia, it's taken Russia a long time to realize, so this is how the game is actually played, and so they're turning their back on Europe, and making friends, improving their relations with all the rest of the world, and the consequence of that, of course, is that the West thought that it could have control of the world, maintain its control of the world, which it had for 500 years. And at this point, they've lost control, and the rest of the world has basically said, we're tired of your bullying to the West, we're tired of it, and we're just going to go our own way. We don't want to fight you, but we're not going to deal with you anymore. So that is basically what has been happening. Now, the problem, of course, is that the West has a very, very destructive mentality, not just destructive towards others, but eventually it's a self-destructive mentality. And witness the fact that after the turn of the century and the 20th century, within 14 years, the colonial powers had turned against each other and fought a ruthless World War I, where millions of young men were sent to slaughter against each other. And this is the leadership of those countries. They simply said, fine, let them get killed for our glory. This is how the leadership of the West, this is the leadership class in the West thinks. And in my opinion, it has never gone away. It was the West's negligence in, not just negligence in supporting Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they actually encouraged it. I mean, there were American industrialists, Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush, he was a banker for the Nazis. And you had many other U.S. industrialists, like Henry Ford was Hitler's best friend. So there's this inherent, hatred towards Russia The seeming inability to just be in the world and live in harmony with other countries. This is a very destructive mindset that seems to be part of Western mentality. And we've reached the point here where, with the introduction of nuclear submarines closer to Russia, these threats towards Russia, threats towards China, threats towards Iran, the genocide of Palestinians without a care, by the Trump administration and the Europeans. After 2 years of this, atrocity, saying, well, gee, maybe we should recognize Palestine. Well, maybe you should have done that in 1948, and not allowed Israel to get away with these criminal acts. So that is the problem that we're facing, is that the leadership of the West is thoroughly corrupt, and it has what I call a gangster mentality. So, and here we are, as I say, on the brink of nuclear war, which from people like Scott Ritter and I was just listening to Lawrence Wilkerson and Larry Johnson. These are people these are serious people, and they're saying, we are on the brink of a very serious nuclear war. And the worst part of it is that the American people and the people in Europe have been so stupefied by decades of consumerism and propaganda that there is no peace movement. So that's the reason why I'm doing my videos. I mean, I've been around for a long time. I've seen a lot. I've been through all these wars, and I know what the empire is about. And so I'm saying, hey guys, wake up. We really need to. It's people. The only people who are going to save us are ourselves. We have to, remove these crazy people from their positions of power, and create a world that is harmonious and works for everybody. So that's what I got to say in this kind of rant here. And again, if you'd like to support my channel, that would be great. I'm considering a trip to Russia for it's an international Buddhist conference which takes place in September. And the point of the conference is to create connections between different Buddhist communities throughout the world, and also to kind of create a sense of how can Buddhist ideas of wisdom and compassion, how can we relate that to the political climate that we're in right now. So that's so if you'd like to help out with that with a contribution on my Substack or to PayPal, my email address will be below this. And thanks a lot for listening, and I'll catch you next time.